Before we start the story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. I pulled my RV into a remote corner of Joshua Tree National Park just as the sun sank below the jagged rocks. The sky shifted to twilight, painted in deep shades of orange and purple, perfect for the photos I had in mind. This trip had been months in the making. The open desert sky, endless stars, and zero city lights were a dream for a hobbyist stargazer like me. My name's Aaron, and I consider myself something of a tech nerd, a city guy through and through, with just enough experience to convince myself I could handle a couple of nights in the desert alone. Setting up my telescope and camera equipment by the fading daylight, I felt a thrill. I'd heard rumors about this place, the mysteries, the strange lights, the whispers of desert spirits. The park rangers at the entrance had even thrown me a cryptic warning. Don't stray too far from your camp at night. I brushed it off. I wasn't here to wander. I was here to shoot the Milky Way and maybe catch a few meteors. A little superstition wasn't going to stop me from getting some amazing shots. Once the equipment was set, I propped my folding chair beside the RV, took a deep breath, and relaxed. The desert was cool and eerily quiet. Every rock and twisted Joshua tree cast in long shadows by the moonlight. But it wasn't silent. The wind picked up in odd, sporadic gusts, making the dry scrub and stones creak and whisper. That was fine with me. I was in my element. Or so I thought. Around midnight, after a couple of solid shots of the star-streaked sky, I saw it. A blue light hovering out in the distance. It was faint, almost like a candle, flickering in the dark. I squinted, wondering if someone else was out here. I hadn't seen another car for miles. The light held steady for a moment, then faded and reappeared even closer, shifting to a soft greenish hue. I raised my camera, snapped a few shots, but each photo was dark. The light, whatever it was, didn't show up. I frowned, muttering to myself. Probably a reflection or some weird atmospheric thing. I didn't believe it, but I convinced myself that if I kept an eye on it, I'd find some logical explanation. Yet, the light kept moving, drifting closer, only to vanish and reappear further off. It didn't seem to have a source. No footsteps, no one calling out, just the strange, floating glow. And then I felt something odd, an urge, a pull that whispered to me, "Follow it, get closer." Maybe it was just curiosity, maybe it was boredom, but the draw was strong. I grabbed my flashlight and took a step forward. I walked for what felt like an hour, stumbling over rocks and sand, my eyes fixed on the faint glow ahead of me. The light flickered like it was beckoning me, pulling me along. I glanced back once, seeing the shape of my RV far in the distance, and a jolt of hesitation crept in. "This is dumb, Aaron," I whispered to myself, swallowing the unease. "Just get a closer look, then go back." But each time I got close, the light drifted further away. It was playful, almost mocking, flickering just beyond the reach of my flashlight. The desert looked different, too, more jagged and surreal, as though the landscape had twisted into something alien. And that's when my phone buzzed. I pulled it out, confused. It was almost dead, though I'd charged it before I left. The GPS app blinked on, showing me in the middle of nowhere, and my compass started to spin, pointing nowhere, just spinning. The light flickered ahead, closer than ever. Part of me wanted to turn back, but something else, something curious and a little reckless, urged me to press on. I didn't want to back down from something I couldn't explain. Then I heard a voice. "Aaron!" It was soft, almost like the wind, but unmistakably familiar. It was Josh's voice, my best friend. But that was impossible. Josh wasn't here. He was in LA, probably asleep. My pulse quickened, but curiosity overruled fear. "Josh?" I called out, hating the shaky edge in my voice. Silence stretched around me, heavy and thick, and the light flickered again. "Aaron!" The voice came again, distant, laced with urgency. "This way!" I felt the hairs on my arms rise. That voice was identical to Josh's, even the faint lilt he had when he was serious. It made no sense, but I kept moving, almost against my will, feeling more like a puppet than a man. Each step felt wrong, like the ground was shifting beneath me, but I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. I don't know how far I walked, but soon I was surrounded by jagged rocks and strange, twisted shadows. And there, in front of me, was the blue light, hovering just above the ground. It was no more than 10 feet away, still flickering, and then it shifted again, this time forming a shape, almost like a figure, vaguely human, but distorted, like someone had taken a person and stretched them out, pulling at the joints. I froze, feeling the air go cold. The light hovered closer, illuminating something on the rocks nearby. Petroglyphs, etched shapes that spiraled and twisted in patterns I couldn't recognize. They were old, ancient, like they'd been left here as warnings. The figure moved closer, its body flickering in the dim light, and the whisper came again. Softer now, almost pleading. "Aaron, come closer." And this time it wasn't just Josh's voice. It was my dad's. I hadn't heard his voice since he passed years ago, but there it was, familiar, gentle. I felt my knees weaken, the familiar pang of grief mixing with terror. What are you?" I whispered, finally pulling my flashlight to aim directly at the light. For a split second, the light stilled and I saw it, an outline of a face staring back at me, but twisted, stretched beyond recognition. And then it flickered out, just vanished, like it had never been there. Panic surged through me. I spun around, scanning the darkness, but the RV was nowhere to be seen. My flashlight barely penetrated the thick blackness, and I was alone, lost. My mind raced, scrambling for any sense of direction, but the compass app on my phone spun erratically, the needle darting wildly, and my phone, of course, had no signal. "Damn it!" I shouted, the desert swallowing the sound. I forced myself to breathe, turning in what I hoped was the direction of my RV, and began walking, but each step only led me deeper into the unfamiliar landscape. That's when the lights came back. This time, there were more of them, soft, yellowish orbs floating in the air, forming a loose circle around me, pulsing in and out like the beat of a heart. The lights danced, bobbing and weaving, and I realized they were guiding me, pointing me somewhere, but where? One by one, the orbs took on faces. People I knew. Josh, my dad, my sister, even my high school girlfriend, their expressions shifting between warm smiles and eerie grins. Their eyes were hollow, black, and fixed on me, never blinking. They were getting closer. I stumbled back, feeling the ground slip beneath my feet. I tried to move, but my legs felt like lead. The lights grew brighter, merging together, surrounding me with a radiant glow. The whispers grew louder, insistent, each voice calling my name, overlapping until it was all I could hear. And then they shifted again, this time into a single shape, a towering, distorted figure, barely human, with hollow eyes and elongated limbs. Its face, a warped blend of everyone I'd ever loved, stared back at me, unblinking. "Aaron," it whispered, voice breaking apart. "Stay with us." "No," I gasped, backing up until my heel hit a rock and I stumbled, almost falling. My heart thundered as I scrambled to my feet. "I need to go back. I need to, The figure moved forward, stretching out a hand, and the petroglyphs on the rocks seemed to glow, casting the desert in an eerie light. It felt like the ground was shifting again, drawing me further in, but I forced myself to look away, to close my eyes. My mind was reeling, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't look back, not at the lights, not at the figure. I clenched my fists, digging my nails into my palms, and took a shaky step forward, then another, listening for anything that sounded familiar, the hum of the RV, the crunch of gravel, anything. The whispers followed, lingering in my ears, coaxing me to open my eyes, to look back. But I didn't. I kept moving, my breaths shallow, my skin crawling with every step. I don't know how long I walked, blind and stumbling, but eventually the air shifted, the ground solidified, and I heard it, the faint hum of my RV generator. I opened my eyes, and there it was, parked just a few feet away, like it had been waiting for me. I ran, throwing myself inside and locking every door and window. I sat there, shivering, my body shaken with exhaustion and fear. The lights were gone, but the desert outside my window seemed darker, as if something was still watching. The whispers faded, but I knew they weren't gone. Not really. They'd come back, waiting for the next person foolish enough to follow them. The next morning, I left without looking back, driving out a Joshua tree in silence. But the memory of those lights, their hollow faces, and the pull of their whispers stayed with me. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I swear I can still hear my name, drifting on the wind, because some things, once you see them, never really leave. I turned off the RV's ignition and took a deep breath, stretching my arms. The silence was incredible out here in Lake Tahoe's desolation wilderness. Beside me, Leah shifted in her seat, glancing out the window as the last rays of sun disappeared behind the treetops. "You okay?" I asked, catching her nervous expression in the fading light. She gave me a tight-lipped smile. "Just quiet, that's all." "Isn't that why we're here? Peace and quiet?" I laughed, hoping it would ease her nerves. Leah was always a little on edge when we camped, and I'd picked this spot for its isolation. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, no distractions. Just us, our RV, and the vast, empty wilderness. A 4th anniversary getaway. But tonight, as I looked out over the dense forest, even I felt something was off. Not that I'd admit it. Leah worried enough for both of us, and I didn't want her stress spoiling our first night. So I shrugged it off, hoping the feeling was just city tension lingering in my head. We settled into our tiny home on wheels, making a quick dinner and sipping cheap wine from plastic cups. Leah pulled out her camera and took pictures of the evening shadows creeping through the trees. She had a photographer's eye, always catching things in the background that I missed. "It's weird how quiet it is, right?" she asked suddenly, lowering her camera. "I mean, that's the point, isn't it? Some real peace and quiet," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. "No, I mean, there's no animal sounds, no crickets, no birds." Her voice dropped, and she glanced around the trees. "It's like they're scared to be here." I forced a laugh. "Come on. Maybe it's just the time of year. Or maybe they're scared of us city slickers." She smirked but didn't laugh. I could tell it was going to take more than jokes to calm her down tonight. As we finished eating, she packed away her camera, and we finally settled into bed. I closed my eyes, savoring the stillness and feeling the relaxation kick in, the peaceful quiet I'd been craving. But just as I drifted into sleep, I heard a faint scraping sound on the side of the RV. I opened my eyes, heart thumping. Leah was fast asleep, breathing softly beside me. Probably just a tree branch brushing against the RV, or an animal, maybe a bear. I reminded myself that animals were normal in these parts and squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to ignore it. The sound came again, louder this time. It was a scratching, almost like fingernails on metal, tracing across the side of the RV. I sat up, peering out the window, but all I saw was darkness and faint, swaying shadows. I shook my head, laying back down. Just my nerves acting up. When morning finally came, the night felt like a distant memory. Leah was cheerful, the unease of the night before apparently forgotten. She even teased me, laughing when I mentioned the sounds. "Bears, David. You probably scared it off by looking out the window," she joked, then slung her camera over her shoulder and hopped out of the RV. "Come on, let's go exploring." We followed a nearby trail, Leah snapping photos of the twisted trees, the jagged rock formations, the silent, mirror-like lakes. The morning was beautiful, almost magical, the kind of peaceful I'd imagined. I could see Leah finally relaxing, her face softening as she moved among the pines, her camera shutter clicking in quick bursts. When we returned, the sun was just starting to dip below the trees. Leah was laughing, a real laugh this time, her earlier fear forgotten. But as we approached the RV, something caught my eye, a faint pattern of marks on the windows. "What's that?" I murmured, stepping closer. There, smeared across the glass, were long, thin handprints. The fingers were elongated, much longer than any human hand should be. They looked twisted, splayed out unevenly. For a second, I felt an icy chill crawl up my spine. Leah came up behind me and gasped. What made those?" "Probably a bear," I said quickly, though I knew it wasn't true. The shape was all wrong. Bears didn't have fingers like that. Leah backed away, staring at the marks. I tried to shrug it off, but I could see her fear creeping back. We headed inside, locking the RV doors, and I reassured her it was nothing, though I was starting to feel the same dread I'd felt last night. It clung to me, heavy and oppressive. As night fell, we sat in silence, listening to the world outside, or rather, listening to the eerie absence of sound. Again, no crickets, no rustling, just silence. A thick, unnatural silence that made every creak in the RV sound like a thunderclap. And then the footsteps started. They were soft at first, just a faint crunch of gravel around the RV. Leah grabbed my arm, her eyes wide, and I held a finger to my lips, listening. The steps circled us, slow and deliberate. Then, from somewhere near the back, I heard a faint whisper. "Leah." It was my voice. I froze, feeling my heart drop into my stomach. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, gripping my arm tight enough to bruise. I nodded, my mind reeling. I'd heard it clear as day, and it had sounded exactly like me. "David! David!" The voice was softer this time, coming from the other side of the RV. I couldn't breathe. I had no idea what was out there, but it was moving around us, calling in voices that sounded like us, repeating our names with a mocking lilt. I glanced at Leah. Her face was pale, eyes darting back and forth like a trapped animal. "Stay here," I mouthed, grabbing the flashlight and heading to the window. I pressed my face to the glass, shining the light outside. And there it was, barely visible in the beam. A figure, tall and thin, with skin stretched tight over its skeletal frame, stood just beyond the trees. Its eyes glinted, catching the light like an animal's, and its lips twisted into an unnatural grin. It was almost human, but not quite. It had a twisted, contorted look, its arms too long, its limbs crooked. And then it did something that froze me to my core. It tilted its head and opened its mouth, letting out a low, guttural laugh that sounded just like mine. "David?" Leah's voice was barely a whisper. "Shh," I hissed, but it was too late. The creature's head snapped up, focusing on the RV. It took a single, slow step forward, its movements unnatural, like a puppet on strings. I felt a wave of terror hit me, realizing that we were trapped, isolated in the middle of nowhere, with this thing circling us. "Leah, we need to leave. Now." She nodded, wide-eyed, and scrambled for her bag. I turned the ignition key, praying it would start. The engine sputtered, then died. "Come on," I muttered, turning it again. The same sputter. The headlights flickered, casting weak beams into the darkness, illuminating empty space. The creature was gone, or so I thought. "David!" Leah's voice cracked and she pointed out the window. It was back, closer this time, crouching beside the RV, one hand pressing against the glass. The long skeletal fingers tapped against the window, creating a slow, rhythmic sound. Tap, tap, tap. I felt sick, terror rooting me in place. I could see Leah was barely holding it together, her breath coming in short gasps. I wrapped my arm around her shoulders, pulling her close, trying to think. The creature tapped a few more times, then vanished again, slipping back into the shadows. "We can't stay here," Leah whispered, her voice choked. "We're going to have to run for it," I replied, my own voice sounding thin. "We'll head toward the main road. There's bound to be someone out there, right?" She nodded, her face pale. I grabbed my pocket knife, a pathetic defense, but it was all we had. Together, we opened the door, stepping into the cool night air. The forest seemed darker than before, the trees looming like silent sentries. We'd barely taken 2 steps when the creature appeared again, blocking the path. It grinned, wide and menacing, and mimicked my voice, whispering, "David." We turned and ran in the opposite direction, stumbling over rocks and roots. Every time I looked back, I saw it just behind us, stalking us through the trees, moving with an impossible speed. Finally, the trail broke and we stumbled into a small clearing. We were alone, but I could still hear the creature's whispers echoing around us, growing fainter, yet no less terrifying. "David," it called, a final, mocking whisper before silence fell. When rescuers found us hours later, Leah was crying, barely able to speak. I tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed us. They said we'd gotten lost, that our minds had played tricks in the dark. But I knew the truth. I can still hear it, sometimes in my dreams. The voice, the tapping, the memory of a creature that mimicked our words, our faces, drawn closer with every step. And I know, deep down, that somewhere out in those woods, it's still waiting. I drove deeper into the Allegheny National Forest, savoring the quiet. The air here felt still and heavy, like an ancient presence lingered in the dense pines. This place was everything I craved. Miles from the nearest cell tower, far from the hum of traffic, and best of all, far from other people. Just me and the silence, a real test of my survival skills, and exactly the reset I needed. I'd heard about Minister Creek from a fellow survivalist who'd raved about the isolation it offered. Perfect. I pulled my RV into a secluded campsite, tucked against a wall of trees, and breathed in the cool, pine-scented air. Setting up took no time. I was efficient, methodical, years of practice making every step feel like routine. The quiet around me was thicker than I expected. No birds, no rustling of small animals. Just me and the forest. It felt good. As I checked my compass and glanced over the nearby trails, I heard a soft rustling in the trees behind me. I turned, hand instinctively on my knife, but it was only a ranger, tall and broad-shouldered, watching me with a wary look. "Name's Nate," he said, his voice deep and scratchy like he'd been smoking too many cigars. "You here alone?" "Yeah," I replied, nodding toward my RV. "Just me. Figured I'd get away from the noise, practice some survival skills." He scratched his chin and glanced at the woods. "Minister Creek is a quiet place, but some parts of it aren't. Friendly to strangers. We've had folks get turned around. I'd recommend sticking close to the trails, you know, and don't go wandering after dark." I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. I'd been through worse wilderness than this. "I'll be fine. Appreciate the advice, though." He nodded, his gaze lingering a moment too long. "Just remember, the trees here can get restless." I watched him amble back to his truck, his silhouette fading into the shadows. Restless trees. Strange-ish thing for a ranger to say, but I brushed it off. Superstition didn't scare me. I had spent years in places more dangerous than any forest. My first night passed quietly, though the silence began to weigh on me. It was almost unnatural. No bird calls, no breeze, just stillness, thick as fog. I forced myself to ignore it and drifted into a restless sleep. But in the early morning, a strange sound woke me. A whisper. Faint, like someone calling from far away. "Seth, Seth." The voice barely broke the silence, but it was unmistakable, and it knew my name. I jerked upright, heart pounding, straining to hear. I stepped outside, looking around. No footprints, no sign of anyone nearby, just the quiet woods. "Must be the wind," I muttered, brushing it off. But as I set out my gear for breakfast, I found my things slightly disturbed. My supplies, normally organized and neatly packed, were scattered around the small clearing. A container of jerky had been pulled open, my water bottle tipped over. Maybe I hadn't closed them properly, or an animal had gotten into my stuff. It was a plausible enough explanation, but something about it unsettled me. The quiet, the whisper, the scattered gear, it was all piling up in a way I couldn't quite ignore. That night, I made sure everything was secure before I crawled into bed, knife close at hand. Hours passed, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. But the soft sounds returned. Footsteps circling my RV, the faintest crack of twigs breaking underfoot. "Seth!" The voice, closer now, more insistent. My heart hammered in my chest. I sat up and pressed my ear against the RV door, trying to hear more clearly. I strained to listen, but all that met my ears was silence again, thicker than before. I felt watched, as if 100 eyes were on me, observing me from the shadows. I wanted to open the door and confront whatever was out there, but something told me to stay put. The next morning, I checked around the RV and found faint tracks in the dirt. Human-like, but not quite right. Longer than any footprint I'd ever seen. I crouched down, examining the impressions. My survival instincts kicked in, and I pulled out my knife, feeling its comfort and weight in my hand. The thought that someone might be stalking me flitted through my mind, but I dismissed it. Who would come this far just to mess with me? I couldn't shake the unease. I glanced around, eyeing the forest, but the tall pines gave me nothing. Just that impenetrable silence. The third night, things got worse. I was outside, checking my gear by the dim glow of my flashlight when I heard something again. A whisper, but closer now, coming from just beyond the line of trees. My name, spoken in a voice I recognized. My sister's voice, soft and pleading. "Seth, please, come help me." Chills shot down my spine. My sister was miles away, back in the city. It couldn't be her. But the voice was so clear, so familiar. I took a step back, my heart racing, my mind fighting to explain it. Then I saw it. A figure, just at the edge of my light. Tall, impossibly thin, with elongated limbs that moved in jerky, unnatural motions, as if it was trying to mimic human movement but didn't quite know how. Its face was blurred, stretched like melting wax, but it held my gaze with empty, lifeless eyes. My flashlight flickered and the figure vanished, slipping back into the shadows. I forced myself to breathe, gripping my knife so tight my knuckles went white. I'd faced enemies before, fought men in close combat, but this, whatever it was, it didn't follow any logic I understood. I felt its gaze, though I couldn't see it anymore, and a suffocating sense of dread sank into my bones. I stumbled back to my RV, bolting the door behind me and checking every lock. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, gripping my knife, praying that whatever it was wouldn't come any closer. By morning, my head was a fog of exhaustion and fear. My body ached and I was jumpy, barely able to keep my thoughts straight. But one thing was clear: I needed to leave. Whatever was out here, it wasn't something I could fight or scare off. I had to get out before it found me again. I hurried to pack up, but as I started the engine, it sputtered, choking out after only a few seconds. I cursed and tried again, but the RV wouldn't budge. I checked everything, and it all seemed intact, but it was as if something was blocking my way, keeping me anchored here. Desperation clawed at me. I grabbed my compass and survival pack, determined to hike out. I'd get back to the main road and find help, but as I stepped outside, a heavy dread settled over me. I knew, somehow, that I wasn't alone. I hiked through the trees, following the path I'd scouted on my first day, but the trail twisted in ways I didn't recognize. The forest itself seemed to shift, rearranging to trap me. I felt watched, followed, each step echoing with the faintest whispers, my name drifting through the air in strange, familiar voices. After what felt like hours, I stopped to catch my breath. The silence was back, thick as fog, wrapping around me. And then, out of nowhere, Nate's voice, soft and urgent, calling from somewhere close by. "Seth, don't run." I turned, heart hammering, to see him standing just a few feet away. But something was wrong. His eyes were too wide, his grin too fixed. His arms hung at strange angles, almost like a marionette on strings. "Nate?" My voice cracked, fear clawing at my throat. He tilted his head, his face twisting in a grin that stretched too far. Stay with us, Seth. The creature moved closer, a grotesque mockery of Nate's face, melting and reforming as it stepped forward. I stumbled back, holding my knife out, knowing it was useless but needing something, anything, to hold on to. In a blur, it lunged, and I swung wildly. My knife passed through empty air, the figure dissolving, then reforming behind me. A low, guttural whisper filled my ears, each word twisting my insides. "You can't leave. You're ours now." My breath came in short gasps as I ran, blind with terror, deeper into the forest. The creature's whispers echoed all around me, calling my name, mocking my fear. I ran until my legs burned, until my vision blurred with exhaustion. I collapsed against a tree, the darkness pressing in. I don't know how long I lay there, too exhausted to move, too terrified to close my eyes. When I finally forced myself up, the forest seemed to have shifted, every tree and rock unfamiliar, like the woods had swallowed me whole. I was found 3 days later by a search party led by another ranger. I was babbling, half crazed, my clothes torn and filthy. They said I'd been talking to myself, pleading with shadows, my mind cracked by isolation. But as they led me out of the forest, I looked back just once and saw Nate's face among the trees, his grin, wide and twisted, following me, even as they guided me out. I still hear the whispers sometimes, late at night, calling my name, urging me to return. Because now I know I'll never truly escape the whispering pines. I was running on fumes by the time I finally turned off the road onto a rocky trail leading into Big Bend. I'd been on the road for months, moving through the Southwest, capturing the wildest and most isolated places left in America. Big Bend was my final stop, the last place on my map before heading home. I pulled the RV over in the shadow of the mountains, parked and shut off the engine. The silence hit me like a wall. Big Bend was vast and still, but not in the calming way I'd hoped. This silence was heavy, almost pressing. But I shook off the unease. Paranoia was the last thing I needed to finish this trip. I set up my camera, hoping to get some decent footage before the sun dipped completely below the horizon. The colors here were deep and dramatic, rocky outcrops casting long shadows across the desert, the Rio Grande winding like a dark vein through the landscape. Even with that unsettled feeling creeping up my spine, I had to admit it was beautiful. Once the light faded, I went to review the footage. A few seconds in, though, the screen flickered, a thin line of static buzzing along the bottom. I frowned, fast-forwarding, but it just got worse. The screen broke into patches of static, and I cursed, thinking it was probably just a technical glitch from all the dust. With a sigh, I plugged the battery pack in to recharge and grabbed my flashlight to explore the area. I wanted to check out a rumored old mining camp a few miles away, something I'd read about in a local legend. Miners had once come here, drawn by a rich silver vein. The legend said they'd vanished without a trace, their camp abandoned overnight. Some people swore you could still hear the clink of picks in the middle of the desert night, though most shrugged it off as a ghost story. I'd come here hoping to capture the empty camp. Ghosts, or no ghosts, it'd make for some atmospheric shots. The walk wasn't easy. The trails twisted and disappeared into the darkness, and the landscape seemed to change every few minutes. I swore I'd passed the same saguaro cactus 3 times already. My watch read 11:30, but I was sure I hadn't walked that long. The night air, usually cool in the desert, felt stifling and close, like walking through a cloud of heat. I wiped sweat from my forehead and kept moving, hoping to catch a break in the landscape, maybe a landmark. Then I heard it. A low metallic clink echoed through the darkness, faint but unmistakable. I froze, flashlight casting a weak beam across the jagged rocks. It sounded again, steady, like a hammer striking metal. I took a deep breath and followed the sound, curiosity tugging me forward even as my mind screamed to go back. As I walked, I started to feel a sense of déjà vu, like I was walking in circles. The landscape around me began to feel strangely familiar. I kept thinking I saw something move in the corner of my eye, a flicker in the shadows, but whenever I turned to look, nothing was there. Just emptiness, and that damn clinking, echoing from nowhere. My stomach tightened with dread as I stumbled into a small clearing. It wasn't the mining camp I'd come for, but there was something here, half buried in the dirt. I knelt and dug around it, my fingers brushing against metal. I pulled it free, a rusted pickaxe, weathered and pitted from time. Must have belonged to one of the miners, I muttered, brushing off the dirt. But as I held it, a strange wave of heat washed over me. My skin prickled and the desert air thickened, making it hard to breathe. The sound of the clinking grew louder, faster, echoing in the stillness around me. Suddenly, I felt eyes on me, watching from the darkness. I swung my flashlight around, the beam catching flickers of shadow in the distance. For a split second, I thought I saw figures, faces with hollow eyes, staring at me from the edges of the light. But when I blinked, they were gone. Just empty desert stretching out endlessly. I dropped the pickaxe, my pulse pounding in my ears, and hurried back toward the RV. The walk back felt longer than the walk there. The path winding and looping until I couldn't shake the feeling that I was lost. My flashlight flickered, the battery dying, and I forced myself to keep moving, not daring to look back. When I finally reached the RV, I slumped into the driver's seat, hands shaking. My mouth was dry, and sweat dripped down my face despite the cool night air. I tried to start the engine, but it only sputtered, the lights flickering weakly. No, come on," I muttered, turning the key again. The engine groaned, then died. In the silence that followed, I heard it again, that faint clinking coming from somewhere behind me. Slowly, I turned and peered out of the back window, scanning the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but the barren desert and the pale glow of moonlight. But then, movement, shadows flickering in and out, figures drifting through the darkness. I backed away from the window, my breath catching. They were getting closer, the shadows moving like specters, drawn to the RV. And then, one of them turned, locking eyes with me. Its face was hollow, sunken, as if it had been carved from the rock itself. It lifted a bony hand and pointed toward me, lips moving silently, but I couldn't make out the words. Panicking, I grabbed my camera, hoping to capture the figures, anything that would prove I wasn't losing my mind. I snapped a few shots, but when I looked at the screen, the images were distorted, filled with static and shadows. I could just make out the outlines of faces, twisted and gaunt, staring back at me from the screen. I stumbled back, heart racing. The words of the legend echoed in my mind, how the miners had vanished, leaving only whispers and shadows. I didn't know if these were their ghosts or something worse, something that had claimed them and was now coming for me. The clinking grew louder, almost deafening, as the shadows surrounded the RV, pressing against the windows. Their faces were clearer now, eyes empty and accusing, as though they were demanding something from me. And then I remembered the pickaxe, the artifact I'd pulled from the ground, disturbing their rest. "Leave it buried," one of the shadows whispered, its voice a rasp that chilled me to the bone. I fumbled in my backpack, digging out the pickaxe. It was cold now, heavier than it should have been, as if weighted with the sorrow of those who'd wielded it before. Without thinking, I stumbled out of the RV, the desert night wrapping around me like a shroud. The shadows loomed closer, watching, waiting. With a shaky breath, I dropped the pickaxe on the ground, my heart pounding as I backed away. The clinking stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to swallow the desert whole. The shadows lingered, their hollow eyes watching me, unblinking. Then, as if on some silent cue, they began to fade, drifting back into the darkness, swallowed by the night. I stood, frozen, too terrified to move, until the last shadow vanished, leaving only the empty desert and the sound of my own breathing. I stumbled back to the RV, adrenaline still pulsing through me. I tried the engine again, praying it would start, and this time it roared to life. I didn't waste a second. I floored it, speeding down the trail, the desert whipping past me in a blur. As I drove, I felt an intense heat behind me, radiating through the RV like a furnace. It felt as though something was watching me, its gaze burning through the walls. But I kept driving, not daring to look back. It wasn't until I reached the park's edge that the heat faded, replaced by a strange calm that settled over me. The feeling of being watched lifted, but the memory of those hollow eyes stayed, etched into my mind. Once I was home, I reviewed the footage, hoping to see something, anything that would explain what I'd seen. But every clip was corrupted, filled with static and shadows, distorted beyond recognition. The faces I'd captured were gone, leaving only dark, empty frames. I deleted the files and abandoned the project, plagued by nightmares of hollow-eyed figures calling me back to the desert, whispering for me to leave it buried. Even now, I can still hear the faint clinking of metal on stone when I close my eyes, the echoes of a place where shadows walk the earth and the past never truly dies. I was alone in Wind Cave National Park. The open prairie stretched around me in every direction, vast and untouched, with no signs of other people. That was exactly how I wanted it. No distractions, no interruptions. This was supposed to be my reset, my chance to get away from all the noise and just be. My divorce had finalized 2 months ago. I hadn't expected it to feel this empty afterward, and somewhere between self-help books and whiskey, I decided to pack up my RV and go. Back to what I knew, back to rocks and formations, things that couldn't just leave or change on a whim. I was here for the geology, and maybe the solitude would help sort out the mess in my head. Wind Cave is famous for its intricate underground network, one of the most complex cave systems in the world. It was named for the eerie sounds that sometimes emerged from the caverns, sounds people swore were whispers or low groans. It wasn't the kind of place that needed stories to be creepy, but locals talked of more. Ghosts, ancestral spirits, Lakota Sioux, legends of souls guarding the caves. I'm not superstitious, so I pushed those stories aside. I parked my RV in a small, flat clearing on the edge of a prairie, far enough from other campers to ensure privacy. As I stepped out to stretch, my foot hit something solid. A small stone cairn, weathered and worn, stood near my campsite, probably a leftover from another camper. I kicked it gently, amused by how easily it toppled over. Just rocks, after all. After a quick meal and checking over my equipment, I settled in for the night. The prairie was quiet, just the sound of my breathing and the occasional call of a distant coyote. I leaned back, satisfied, and closed my eyes, ready to sleep in peace. Then I heard it. A faint whisper, a low murmur that drifted in on the wind. I sat up, straining to listen. The sound was too quiet to make out, almost like a chant or low humming, but with a rhythm that made my skin prickle. Probably the wind moving through one of the caves, I thought. Just wind cave, living up to its name. I ignored it, settled back, and eventually I fell asleep. In the morning, I woke early, eager to start exploring. I grabbed my gear and headed toward a cluster of caves I'd mapped out the day before, determined to spend the whole day in the field. But when I passed the cairn on my way out, I stopped. The rocks were stacked again, perfectly aligned, as though they'd never been knocked over. I frowned, my mind racing to find a reasonable explanation. Maybe I hadn't kicked it as hard as I'd thought. Or maybe some ranger was wandering around, trying to keep things tidy. I tried to laugh it off, but as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The caves were fascinating, as always, narrow passages winding deep into the ground, limestone walls marked with unique mineral formations. I snapped photos, took samples, losing myself in the work, but every so often, I'd pause, glancing over my shoulder. That feeling hadn't gone away, a nagging sensation that the shadows in the caves were moving, just out of sight. The whispers started again that night. This time, they were louder, just enough for me to make out fragments of words. The wind carried them across the prairie, brushing past my RV like fingers against glass. I sat in the dark, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone circling the RV. I held my breath, every muscle in my body frozen. There was a soft thud against the side of the RV, followed by a faint scratching, like nails against metal. I waited, heart hammering, until the footsteps faded into silence. My mind scrambled for explanations. Could someone have found my campsite? Was this some kind of local prank? But when I checked outside the next morning, there was no one. Just empty prairie stretching as far as I could see. Then I looked down. The cairn was back, perfectly stacked again, standing at the edge of my camp like some kind of silent warning. On the third night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers had grown louder, a strange chanting that filled my head even when I tried to block it out. I buried my face in my pillow, willing myself to ignore it, but the words, or whatever they were, cut through, persistent and relentless. I started seeing things, too. Just flashes at first, shadows near the edge of the clearing, a figure standing still and silent, watching me. I'd blink, and it would be gone. But every time I looked back, the figure seemed closer. My hands shook as I reached for my flashlight, determined to chase the shadow away. But when I shone the beam into the darkness, there was nothing. Only trees and empty night. I returned to bed, forcing myself to calm down, but sleep didn't come. The next morning, I decided I needed a break. I drove out to a nearby town, looking for some sign of civilization, maybe a coffee shop where I could sit and remember what normal felt like. The barista was friendly, asking if I was a tourist. "Kinda," I muttered, staring into my coffee. "I'm here to study the geology. Haven't been to the caves before." She nodded knowingly. Caves are sacred to some people, you know, especially Wind Cave. It's got history, legend, spirits, if you believe in that stuff." "Spirits?" I asked, feeling silly even as I said it. "The Lakota Sioux believe the cave is a place of creation, that spirits guard it. There are stories of people going out there alone, messing with things they shouldn't." She looked at me pointedly. "Sometimes they say the spirits don't like to be disturbed." I tried to laugh it off, but my voice came out hollow. "It's just an old story, right?" She shrugged. "You're here alone. If I were you, I'd respect the land. And if you find anything strange, like a cairn or a marker, don't touch it." I nodded, but my stomach twisted. The cairn flashed in my mind, and I felt a chill creep over me. I drove back to camp, my thoughts racing, but I told myself I wasn't afraid. Not yet. That night, I lay awake, listening, waiting. The whispers came back, louder than ever, filling the air around me, closing in like a wave. Then I heard the footsteps again, soft and measured, circling my RV. I clutched my flashlight, staring at the door, willing myself to stay calm. A shadow passed by the window, then paused, lingering just outside. I took a shaky breath, my fingers tightening around the flashlight. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice echoing in the small space. The whispers stopped. Silence fell, deep and oppressive, as though the entire prairie had gone still. Then the shadow moved again, this time pressing close to the window, and I saw it. A figure stood there, dark and indistinct, dressed in what looked like ceremonial clothing. Its face was obscured, hidden by shadows, but its eyes, those eyes glowed with a faint, unnatural light, staring straight at me. I scrambled back, heart racing, my hand flying to the lock, but when I blinked, the figure was gone, leaving only the faint sound of chanting in its wake. By dawn, I knew I had to get out. I packed up, every nerve on edge, glancing over my shoulder at every noise. But as I approached the RV door, I noticed the cairn again. This time, it was different. Taller, with stones I didn't recognize. I grabbed my phone, desperate to capture some evidence, something to prove to myself I wasn't losing my mind. But as I raised the camera, a shadow fell over the cairn. I froze, phone clutched in my hand, as a figure appeared beside the stones. It was the same shadowy figure from the night before, tall and gaunt, its face a dark void. It raised one hand, pointing at the cairn, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of dread. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling my mind, my body, pressing down on me like a weight. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And then the chanting stopped. The figure vanished, leaving me standing alone in the empty clearing. My mind was a haze, fear and confusion blurring my thoughts. I knew I had to leave, but some instinct told me the cairn needed to be fixed, that I had to make it right. With shaking hands, I rebuilt the cairn, stacking each stone carefully, muttering apologies under my breath. I didn't know if it would work, but it was all I had. As I placed the final stone, a strange calm settled over me. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifting, and for the first time in days, I could breathe. I climbed into the RV, heart still pounding, and drove away from the clearing. I didn't look back. The prairie stretched out around me, wide and open, but the shadows still lingered at the edge of my vision, flickering in the corners of my mind. I drove in silence, hands gripping the wheel, trying to shake the feeling that something was still watching me. As I passed through the park's entrance, I glanced down at my phone, half expecting to find it empty. But there it was, the final image I'd taken. A dark, shadowy figure, standing beside the cairn, its face blurred and twisted, staring straight at me. I dropped the phone, my breath catching, and floored the accelerator, not daring to look back at the prairie fading behind me. Some things are better left untouched, and some places, sacred, ancient places, have secrets that aren't meant for the living. We had parked the RV in the most remote part of Tahoe National Forest that Sam could find, way off the main trail. It was a perfect spot, she'd said, isolated, scenic, and apparently haunted, according to some local legends she'd looked up for fun. Sam liked that kind of thing, and she wanted an authentic experience. I was just trying not to freak out. There were no other campers for miles, and I knew if anything went wrong, we were on our own. "Look, Chloe, it's beautiful," Sam said as we walked toward the lake, the water mirroring the orange and pinks of the setting sun. "It's all right," I mumbled, clutching my phone and checking for any last bars of signal. Nothing. Luke tossed a few rocks into the lake, shrugging off my nervousness like always. "Come on, Chloe, live a little. We're here for a couple of nights. You'll be telling your grandkids about how you conquered Tahoe's wilds." He grinned, and though I tried to join in the enthusiasm, I couldn't help feeling like something was wrong. "All right," I said with a sigh. "I'll give it a chance." We headed back to the RV where we started setting up camp. Sam and Luke laughed and teased me as we went through our supplies, and I started to feel a bit more relaxed. It was just the forest. The same trees, same sounds I'd heard in any other forest, right? That first night, we built a fire, and I tried to ignore the chill that seemed to settle in as the sun dropped below the horizon. Sam kept prodding Luke to tell some ghost stories, but he said he didn't believe in that supernatural junk. He took a long drink from his water bottle and said, "Now, if Bigfoot showed up tonight, though, maybe then I'd be impressed." Sam laughed, and I forced a smile. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the darkness, and for a moment, everything felt normal. But then I heard it. Faint, barely audible, footsteps rustling in the trees behind us. "Did you guys hear that?" I whispered, my heart pounding. "Hear what?" Sam asked, raising an eyebrow. Luke was about to crack a joke, but then we all heard it. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to circle just beyond the firelight. Sam laughed nervously. "It's probably a deer," she said, though her voice was a little shaky. I nodded, but my stomach was twisted in knots. The footsteps stopped, and all that was left was the silence of the woods. I tried to shake it off as we all crawled into the RV to sleep. The next morning, we stepped outside and I immediately noticed something strange. Large, distorted footprints in the dirt around the RV. They were long, thin, almost human but wrong somehow, with deep claw-like indentations. "What kind of animal would leave those?" Luke asked, scratching his head. "Maybe a bear?" Sam offered, though she looked uncertain. "Or Bigfoot?" I muttered, only half joking. Luke rolled his eyes, but I could see the worry in his expression. I was no expert, but I'd never seen anything like those tracks. We went about the day with a bit more caution. The three of us decided to hike a short loop around the lake, sticking together despite Sam's insistence that we were being paranoid. But the forest felt different today. Shadows seemed to shift just beyond my vision, and once I could have sworn I saw a figure on the far side of the lake, watching us, tall and skeletal, blending with the trees. "Did you guys see that?" I asked, pointing, but when they looked, there was nothing there. Sam rolled her eyes and Luke told me to stop scaring myself. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that we were being watched. That night, things got worse. As we huddled around the fire, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was my own voice calling out from the darkness. "Help! Someone! Help!" The voice was unmistakably mine, distant but clear. I turned to Luke, horrified. He looked at me, equally confused. "Chloe, what's going on?" he asked. I'm right here," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "Maybe it's an echo," Sam suggested, though she looked as unsettled as I felt. But then the voice came again, louder this time, pleading, desperate. "Help me, please." We all stared out into the darkness, paralyzed. Sam clutched my arm, her bravado gone. Luke grabbed a flashlight and pointed it toward the woods. The beam caught only shadows and trees. "Let's get back to the RV," he said, his voice tense. We hurried back, locking the door behind us and closing the curtains. The fire crackled outside and the woods fell silent again. We tried to brush it off, tried to convince ourselves it was just the wind, or maybe even another camper, though we knew there was no one else around. But the creature, whatever it was, wasn't done with us. The following day, as we were packing up to leave, the RV wouldn't start. Luke checked the battery, only to find it was drained. "This is impossible," he muttered, fiddling with the cables, but there was nothing he could do. "We'll have to hike out," Sam said, trying to keep calm. "The ranger station isn't that far. We can get help there." As we started down the trail, I could feel the forest closing in around us. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. And then, halfway to the station, we heard it again. Footsteps, this time close, keeping pace with us. Then, in the distance, I saw it. A gaunt, skeletal figure standing motionless on the trail ahead. It was tall, with an emaciated body and skin stretched tight over bony limbs. Its eyes were sunken, hollow, and lifeless. "Oh my God," Sam whispered, backing away. "What is that?" It's a wendigo," I managed, my voice trembling. I'd read about them once, legends of a creature born from hunger and solitude, a twisted, starved spirit of the woods. We turned and started to run, adrenaline kicking in. But the thing followed, stalking us through the trees, always a few steps behind, its eyes fixed on us. We reached the ranger station and barricaded ourselves inside, frantically searching for anything we could use as a weapon. Luke found a pile of rusty tools, and Sam grabbed a fire poker. The creature circled the building, its footsteps slow and deliberate, dragging its feet along the walls as if testing our defenses. Then it began to mimic us again. "Luke, Sam, Chloe," it called, its voice twisted and distorted. Hearing my own voice spoken back to me by that thing made my skin crawl. The creature scratched at the windows, peering in with those sunken eyes, its mouth stretched into a ghastly, unnatural grin. "Do you think it can get in?" Sam whispered, clutching the fire poker tightly. "Just stay calm," Luke said, though he was visibly shaking. "They say wendigos hate fire and iron. If it tries to come in, we can fend it off." The hours dragged on. The creature didn't stop. It circled the cabin, sometimes close, sometimes farther away, whispering our names, scraping the windows, knocking on the walls. The tension was unbearable. At one point, I swore I saw it standing just outside, staring at me through the window, its empty eyes fixed on mine. Finally, as dawn began to break, the footsteps stopped. The forest fell silent once more, and the creature was gone. We stepped outside, huddling together, still shaken but relieved to be alive. Our legs were sore from standing guard all night, and we were exhausted. But the creature had left, retreating into the shadows of the woods as the first light touched the trees. We limped back to the RV and managed to start it. The battery mysteriously charged again. None of us spoke as we drove away, the forest behind us, now a haunted memory. Back in the city, I tried to forget, to convince myself that it was all just some terrible nightmare. But sometimes, at night, when the world is quiet, I can still hear it, my own voice, calling from the woods. I didn't come to Coconino looking for ghosts. I came to capture the haunting beauty of Arizona's wilderness, planning to camp for a few nights, photograph the stark red cliffs, and hopefully walk away with a few shots worthy of my portfolio. I didn't believe in spirits or monsters, not when I pulled my RV down a deserted trail in the middle of the forest, with no one around for miles. The silence was unnerving, sure, but I'd come to expect that from places this isolated. I was on my second night when I first saw him, a man with a dirty cap and a hollow look in his eyes. He'd been standing near the edge of my camp, watching me from a distance. When I walked toward him, he didn't move, but his eyes locked onto mine as though sizing me up. "You alone out here?" he asked, his voice gruff but low. "Yeah," I replied, crossing my arms. I hadn't seen another person in hours, and his sudden appearance caught me off guard. "Who are you?" "Name's Eli," he replied, looking away as he spoke. "Just want to tell you to stay near your RV and don't wander off. It's not safe out here at night." I laughed, more out of discomfort than humor. "You're the one sneaking up on people in the middle of the forest." He didn't smile. Instead, he nodded slowly, his eyes flicking to the trees beyond us. "This forest, it's old. It's got things in it that don't take kindly to folks nosing around." "Things?" I raised an eyebrow. "Are you talking about coyotes or—" "Coyotes, sure. And other things. I'd stick close to camp if I were you." With that, he turned and disappeared into the trees. I shrugged it off, chalking him up as a paranoid local who'd spent too much time alone. But later that night, after the sun dipped below the cliffs and darkness took over, I felt the weight of his words pressing down on me. I sat by my fire, sorting through the day's shots on my camera, trying to ignore the prickling unease creeping up my spine. A breeze rustled through the pines, and I shivered, feeling as though something unseen was watching me. Then my camera glitched. A brief flicker, and then it powered down, the battery flashing red. Strange, since I'd charged it fully the night before. I swapped batteries, but the replacement died just as quickly. "Cheap junk," I muttered, setting it aside. But that feeling of being watched didn't go away. Instead, it intensified, each snap of a twig or rustle in the brush sending jolts down my spine. The fire crackled softly, but beyond its light, the forest had turned pitch black. Just as I stood to head back to my RV, I noticed something odd. There were tracks in the dirt around my camp. Strange, elongated footprints, not quite human but not animal either, with toes that seemed too long, almost like claws. I shook my head, laughing nervously to myself. "It's just an animal, Ava," I muttered, kicking dirt over the tracks. I climbed into my RV, locked the door, and settled down, trying to shrug off the unsettling feeling that those tracks hadn't been there when I'd set up camp. The next morning, I almost convinced myself it had been my imagination. I busied myself with setting up my camera and taking more shots of the red cliffs glowing under the morning sun. The forest was quiet, peaceful, and the strange events of the night before felt far away. But as I scrolled through the images I'd taken, I noticed something strange. In one of the shots, taken just before sundown, there was a shadow in the background, a tall, gangly shape that seemed to be peering at me from behind a tree. I zoomed in, but the figure was indistinct, more a blur than a person. Yet I could see the outline of its arms and legs, too long and spindly, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. A chill ran through me, but I shook it off, reminding myself that light can do strange things in the forest. I continued with my day, avoiding the dark corners of my mind that threatened to draw me back to Eli's warning. By evening, however, I wasn't laughing anymore. It started with a faint rustling outside the RV, a soft sound that, at first, I took to be wind in the trees. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and methodical, circling the RV. I sat frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. My hand reached for the flashlight and I flicked it on, casting a beam out the window. Nothing, only trees and shadows. But the footsteps continued, relentless, each step deliberate. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear, but the sound had stopped, leaving only the eerie silence of the forest. I was just starting to think I'd imagined it when something scraped against the back window. I jumped, gripping my flashlight tighter, and shone it toward the sound. Outside, in the dim glow of my light, I saw the shadow of a figure, a tall, twisted shape that didn't move, but seemed to be watching me. Its face, if it had one, was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, pressing against the glass. My stomach twisted, and I stumbled backward, feeling the floor sway beneath my feet. I closed my eyes, willing myself to calm down, but when I opened them again, the figure was gone. I spent the rest of the night curled up on the floor, refusing to look outside. I barely slept, each sound outside triggering a fresh wave of terror. By dawn, I was exhausted, but I knew I couldn't stay here another night. I'd take a few more photos, then head out, away from whatever haunted these woods. But as I packed my things, I heard a voice behind me. "Thought I told you to stay close to camp," Eli said, his tone low and reproachful. I spun around, relief flooding over me, mixed with a hint of anger. "Eli, what the hell was that thing last night? Did you do something? Try to scare me?" Eli's face was pale, his eyes fixed on me with a mixture of fear and urgency. "It wasn't me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I told you there's things in this forest that don't want us here." "Things?" I laughed, a hollow sound in the silence. "I saw it, Eli. A person or a creature or whatever it was." He nodded slowly, his face grave. "Skinwalkers, the Navajo call them, witches that take the form of animals or twisted humans. They're dangerous, Ava. They don't just scare people, they hunt them." A shiver ran through me, but I pushed back, refusing to let the fear take hold. "That's just a story. Some legend. You really believe that?" "I didn't want to," he said, glancing over his shoulder as though expecting the creature to be lurking there. "But after seeing one myself years ago, I don't doubt it anymore." As much as I wanted to dismiss his words, something about his expression stopped me. The memory of those footsteps, that shadow at my window, was still fresh, chilling me to my core. "What should I do?" I asked finally, my voice small. Eli studied me, his expression somber. "You've got to leave, Ava. But we need to do something first. A ritual. It might calm the spirit, send it back to where it belongs." I hesitated, but the memory of that creature was still burned into my mind. "All right, what do we have to do?" Eli gave me a pouch of sage and a small container of ash, explaining that we had to circle the creature's tracks, chanting a prayer he'd learned from an old friend of his. As we stepped out of the RV, my heart pounded in my chest, fear clawing at me with every step. I scanned the forest around us, half expecting the creature to appear at any moment. We walked carefully, following the trail of footprints around the RV. I sprinkled the sage as he'd instructed, murmuring the strange words he'd taught me, trying to keep my voice steady. But as we completed the circle, a loud, guttural scream pierced the silence. I froze, my blood turning to ice. In the shadows ahead, I saw it, the creature, tall and gaunt, its yin stretched tight over its bones, its face a twisted mask of hatred and hunger. Eli moved in front of me, his hand steady as he continued the chant, his voice loud and defiant. The creature hissed, its body contorting as though writhing in pain. It clawed at the ground, its eyes fixed on us with a look of pure malice. Then, with a sudden lunge, it sprang toward us. Eli shouted, shoving me aside as he raised the pouch of sage. The creature recoiled, but not before it slashed at him, its claws raking across his arm. He stumbled, blood staining his shirt, but he held his ground, his voice never faltering. "Go!" he shouted, his eyes wild with fear. "Finish the ritual!" I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest as I continued the chant, my voice barely a whisper. The creature advanced on Eli, its limbs twitching and contorting as though fighting an invisible force. But as the final words of the chant left my lips, it let out a furious scream, its body disintegrating into a cloud of dust that hung in the air before vanishing into the night. The forest fell silent, leaving only the soft rustle of the trees. Eli sank to the ground, his face pale, his breathing labored. "Thank you," he whispered, a faint smile crossing his lips. "Maybe now it'll leave us alone." I drove away from Coconino that morning, Eli's warnings and the memory of that creature haunting me every mile of the journey. I never saw Eli again, and I don't know if he made it out of those woods. But when I looked through my camera one last time, I found a single chilling photo. The creature's face, distorted and twisted, glaring back at me from the shadows.